Hello, I'm Mally Schatzfeld, Managing Editor of Endodontic Practice US, a Medmark publication. Welcome to a live presentation and question and answer with Chip Fitchner. In our webinar today, we will be exploring how to monetize your endodontic practice value with an invisible dental support organization. Before we get started, I would like to invite viewers to use the question box in your control panel to ask any questions, and your questions will be answered at the end of the session. Also, associated with this presentation is a free CE quiz. At the end of the webinar, we will email all attendees instructions on how to access the CE quiz. I'm pleased to introduce our guest for today, Chip Fitchner, a successful entrepreneur for 40 years. Chip has started, bought, and sold dozens of businesses and was chairman or CEO of multiple public companies. Chip has been featured in media, including CNBC, The Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Money, Dental Economics, and many others. He has also presented globally on economics, marketing, and practice monetization since 1982. Chip, we turn the webinar over to you to learn more about your topic for today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I appreciate all of you joining us on a Friday. We're going to talk today about something that's really changing the endodontic practice industry, which is the consolidation of endodontic practices. 2 years ago, there were a total of 0 groups acquiring endodontic practices exclusively. Today, there are over 10, and I would expect by the end of the year, there could be 12 to 14 in total. In addition, the multi-specialty groups have become more interested in endodontics thanks to your performance during the COVID shutdown. And so any successful endodontist has the opportunity to consider monetizing a part of the value of their practice. In other words, you could sell anywhere between 51 and 90% of your practice for cash today at today's low tax rates, and yet continue to lead your practice with your brand, your team, your strategy for years or decades into the future. One of the interesting things that most people don't understand about these transactions is that they are exceptionally attractive to younger doctors. Younger doctors see this as an opportunity to take some chips off the table, diversify what is their primary asset, their practice, and yet continue to lead their practice and access the resources of a larger partner to grow bigger, better, faster, and more profitably. And that growth might come internally. It might be by opening de novo offices. It might even be by acquiring competitors in your region. So there are a lot of opportunities, and it pays to understand the opportunity, frankly, to put cash in your pocket today at today's low tax rates, because I'm not sure anyone believes that taxes are not going up. One of the interesting things that we specialize in is younger doctors, and what we always tell our prospective partner buyers, the invisible DSOs, and we'll talk about what that is in a second, is that the doctors that we bring are generally the doctors that did not want to do a transaction. We don't do a lot of retiring doctors seeing this process as a transition because they typically don't have the time horizon that's required to achieve the highest values. And that time horizon is typically doctors who want to continue practicing for a minimum of 3, preferably 5, and frankly, the invisible DSOs would prefer you to stick around until you die. Quick commercial on us. We're the largest advisor primarily to specialists across the country. We have done dozens of transactions at exceptionally high values. We'll talk about how we get high values in a little bit, but we do operate nationally. And last year we did complete transactions for clients literally from Honolulu to Boston. Quick summary about what we did last year because it's relevant to what we're doing this year. And this year is interesting because of the potential impending tax problems. More and more doctors are interested in the concept of monetizing a part of their practice. This is a really growing category. We were excited to do $300 million in transactions last year. And so far this year, we've signed over $168 million in new client value in, 100 days. So this concept is catching on and it's being driven by fears of tax increases. The good news is that the new multiple buyers that are interested in endodontic practices have driven values up when you can get into a competitive bidding situation. These endodontic groups, some of them are looking nationally, some are looking only regionally. And the multi-specialty groups have really become a lot more active in 21 than they were in 20. Most of the multi-specialty groups spent most of 20 trying to triage their typically big GP group base that did not perform as well in the shutdown as endo practices did. The number of transactions in endo, my guess at 100 plus could be low. But again, we specialize only in the larger practices, so we don't see what's going on in the smaller practices. So what makes an endo practice valuable in a partial monetization? Number one is size. The bigger you are, the more valuable you are. The younger you are, the more valuable you are. And your growth rate and your performance during the shutdown, and more importantly, your performance in Q4 and Q1, so Q1 of this year, is very important. They want to see that you survived the shutdown and are back to growth. They're also very interested in doctors that have a plan. I was talking to an endo right before this call who said, I have two friends that I think would be very interested in doing this as well, and that could enable us to triple the size of our group. And I said, yeah, that's absolutely going to increase your value and their value, so it's a win-win for all of you. Let's talk a little bit about the big elephant in the room, which is what happens when taxes go up. The new president has said very clearly that he believes that the rich are not paying their fair share, and that includes endodontists, I'm afraid. His definition of rich is if you made $400,000 or more last year, and so he's going to hurt you. And frankly, any dentist who doesn't pursue a monetization this year is functionally gambling that taxes won't go up in 22 and beyond. I think that's a bad bet. I think given the amount of spending that's going on, taxes are going to be increased significantly, and it's not going to be on the poor folks. So this is one of my favorite topics, is do the rich pay their fair share? And clearly, as you can see here, the top earners are paying the majority of the income taxes, but they would like you to pay more. One of the reasons that drives doctors of all ages to potentially monetize a part of their practice is because it is your largest single asset in your portfolio. The other assets in your portfolio, frankly, performed a lot better, no matter what your assets were, than the value of your practice. So doctors see this as an opportunity to potentially get some liquidity, pay a low tax rate on that liquidity, and grow their practice. Talk about the dental industry. It's surprising to me sometimes how doctors don't realize how valuable your industry is. It has been very attractive to investors for decades. Some of the larger DSOs are up to 30 years old, and they like dentistry because it is a consistent, relatively low-risk business. COVID may have changed some of that view a little bit. But it has attracted investors for decades who have all made a lot of money. Not only the investors, but the doctors who partnered with investors to grow their practice and grow the groups that they chose. Dental consolidation is still in its infancy. This gives you what dental looks like compared to some of the other industries that are in the process of being consolidated. The granddaddy of this is, of course, MDs. MDs today are over 75% consolidated, meaning that MDs are either affiliated with large hospitals or large groups 75% of the time. So let's talk about an actual example of why groups are interested in investing in dental. This is one of the larger DSOs in the U.S., and this is what the value of their group has done over the last 22 years. So if you were a doctor who joined the group in December of '99, the value of your investment in that DSO has gone up 200 times. And I actually know a doctor who was in this group who retained $1 million in equity, and he exited when they sold to Kohlberg, Kravis, and Roberts in March of 18, and he put $150 million in his pocket before tax. He then took that money and started his own DSO, and he has actually bought practices from us since then. So these are not myths, these are real. Another group recapitalized in January. They increased their value from $300 million in October of 17 to almost $1.5 billion on January 31st of 2021. So in 39 months, the shareholders in their group had that kind of return. That is why money is attracted to dental consolidation, and why, frankly, it's accelerating. And that's an example of how it is accelerating. Part of the reason that the newly formed DSOs and the existing multi-specialty groups are interested in endodontics is the specialists typically have higher revenues, and they are very interested in buying the biggest practices that they can find. If you don't think consolidation is here, we completed a transaction in October of 19 that filled out the map, the last two states that didn't have a DSO, which were Montana and Wyoming. We sold a group, the largest orthos in both states then, and so now all 50 states have a DSO. Another exciting thing that's happening, we talked a little bit about that transaction, and there are more of these that are in process. I would expect to see 3 of the top 10 largest DSOs sell up the food chain, meaning their investors will book their gains, their doctors will book their gains, and they will have new investors by the end of the year. And there will probably be another 20 transactions over $100 million this year as the investors in these groups strive to take advantage of the current boom in the stock market. But let's go back to taxes. One of the things that we see by looking at hundreds of practice financials every year is that in many cases, some of your personal expenses may have slipped into the practice's P&L. Fortunately, the buyers understand that that accidentally happens from time to time, and so we get to add back any personal expenses that might have slipped into your business account, and so you don't really have to worry about it. However, on a go-forward basis, President Biden has been very clear that he plans to dramatically increase the IRS's budget such that there are more audits. And if you missed it, Senator Warren has proposed to fund the IRS enough that anybody making over $400,000 a year should be audited automatically every 3 years. So that may change some of your tax planning. Fortunately, your friends at the states are also planning to increase your taxes. New York just passed a new tax regulation yesterday, which will increase them to the highest. New York City will be the highest tax venue in the state, beating out California. If you're in New York City and you make a lot of money, your tax rate will be 14.7%, beating out California, who at the moment is only 13.3%. But don't worry, California is going to grab the crown back because they are proposing a rate for high earners that will get your state tax rate in California up to over 16%. So congratulations to those of you in California. You pay for your good weather. This is just some of the examples of what's being proposed at the state level. Washington didn't want to be one of the 7 states left without an income tax, so they have proposed to give you a state income tax, something that you didn't have before. So I talked a lot about taxes. Let's look at the actual math of what happens. Functionally, your practice, if Biden's tax proposal is passed, becomes worth 25% less net after tax come January 1st of 2022, assuming that's when it's effective. A lot of people have asked if Biden's going to pull a Clinton and make taxes retroactive, as Clinton did in August of 1993. He made them retroactive to January 1 of 93. He was sued on that, or the administration was sued on that, and the administration won. And so taxes were retroactive. We and the experts that we talked to do not believe that Biden is going to propose that this year, given the state of the pandemic and the financial condition of the country. So here's another example of what the impact of higher taxes is going to look like for you. The math is pretty simple. Now, the key is that, in short, if your practice can grow its bottom line 10% per year in 22, 23, 24, and 25, you will get back to even as to what your practice was worth today net. Now, if you can't grow 10% per year and you have state taxes on top of that, as 43 states, soon to be 44, have, the reality is your practice may never get back to today's value. The math is really pretty simple, and your accountant can help you with it. I use Talbot County, Maryland there because they have a nice big fat county tax on top of the state tax on top of the federal tax. So let's suppose you can grow your practice. We hear that from a lot of doctors saying, you know what, post-COVID, I'm absolutely booming. Now is not the time for me to monetize, no matter what the taxes are. And so here's what happens if you were able to produce a 25% growth in your practice EBITDA or profitability. EBITDA, by the way, stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And don't forget to take out a number for doctor compensation, because somebody has to pay you to do the work that you do. Taxes also matter in structures. We always tell doctors that one of the reasons an advisor like us is handy is because one of the key negotiation points is called the tax allocation agreement. In the tax allocation agreement, you negotiate with your buyer as to what percentage of the purchase price will be counted as goodwill versus what will be considered tangible assets. In a lot of doctor directly to DSO transactions, it's to the DSO's benefit to make goodwill lower and tangible assets higher. So we see a lot of, in retrospect, doctor to DSO transactions without an advisor, where the transactions end up at 50% or less in goodwill. And what that means is the amount that is goodwill is long-term capital gains. The amount that's tangible assets is ordinary income. So the tax rate is about double when doctors deal directly with DSOs or don't understand the importance of that one little piece of a deal. One of the things that COVID has actually been good for doctors, especially those that are growing, is that an earnout has become a component of virtually every transaction that we do, in that it enables us to price doctors who did not in 20 exceed their profitability in 19. We're able to get buyers to price practices based on 19 performance. And then there's what's called a COVID holdback, which means they're going to hold back a part of your proceeds until your practice returns to 2019 levels. For doctors who are growing or who might have had a 2020 better than 2019, the earnout component becomes a huge win, because they're basically going to pay you for your growth, typically in the 1, 2, or 3 years after a transaction, and the numbers can be considerable. I won't get into what personal goodwill is, but one of the things that we spend a lot of time doing, because fortunately my partner has a law degree and a master's in tax, and therefore we spend a lot of time making sure that transactions are structured properly for our doctors so that they have the lowest tax impact. One of the key issues in negotiating a transaction of this type is the compensation rate that the doctor is going to be paid in the future. And in here, this gives you an example of the difference between getting paid 30% of collections post-closing and getting paid 40% of collections post-closing. Once doctors understand this math, they are eager to get the lowest ongoing pay rate as possible, because a reduction in the future pay rate for the doctor results in a higher value up front and therefore more cash at long-term capital gains tax rates. So it's important to understand the various moving pieces, because they have a dramatic impact on the initial value of your practice. So in our business, there are functionally two different types of DSOs. First, we call the rebranding buyers. These are the DSOs that you know and have heard of and are in every strip center in America. And then there are the invisible DSOs. These are dental support organizations whose mission is to invest in great practices by buying a part of them, but the doctor remains, it's his brand, his team, his strategy, and they value your local goodwill. Fortunately, the invisible DSOs are far more prevalent than the rebranding buyers, and the invisible DSOs at the moment are paying significantly higher values than the rebranding buyers. So a rebranding buyer will typically buy 100% of your practice. Some of that may be in the form of equity in the parent company. This is not a bad strategy, and many doctors over 60 like this because it takes away all management and all headaches. In an invisible DSO transaction, you continue to lead and manage your practice. Certainly, your invisible DSO partner will take certain elements of the administrative minutia off your desk, and they will handle it, such as payroll, benefits administration, the benefits plan, and banking. But they still want you as an owner, because you're motivated as an owner, not as an employee. And there are lots of examples that prove that an owner-operated practice is far more profitable than an employee-operated practices. Each of the invisible DSOs is different, and keep in mind there are hundreds of them, and they're adding at least one new DSO every 2 weeks. The money behind a DSO varies. Most people believe it's only private equity. The reality is there are other investors that are very active in the DSO space. Last year in the fourth quarter alone, we did transactions of over $100 million with family office-backed DSOs. And each of these have a different perspective on what they're trying to accomplish by investing in great dentists. The family offices typically have a much longer perspective from a time horizon. As an example, in 2019, the largest transaction in the DSO world was a Swiss family office who had made their $12 billion in chocolate and owned one of the largest DSOs in Europe, bought one of the 10 largest DSOs in the US for over $700 million, and they have a 50-year time horizon on that investment. Whereas private equity groups have a different time horizon, and their goal is to monetize their investment in dental, typically within 3 to 7 years, with 5 years kind of being the average number. One of the other things that's relatively new in the invisible DSO world is there are groups now that are going what we'll call infrastructure light, meaning they're not setting up a world headquarters with 10, 20, 50, hundreds of people at the world headquarters to help supervise and promote their practices. Some of them are what we'll call infrastructure light. So that's one of the things that you evaluate as you go through the dating process. We'll talk about that in a second. But one of the interesting things that doctors don't fully realize is that while an invisible DSO can be your friend if you join one, you need to be prepared to compete with them because they are coming. And I'll give you a quick story of a orthodontist that we had in a town of 100,000 people in the Midwest. There were 4 other orthodontists in town. He happened to be the largest. He became our client, and we sold him to the invisible DSO that owned the 5 pedo practices in town. Historically, the 5 pediatric dental practices had not been referring our client orthodontic cases. They were referring to the other 4 doctors in the community. And once they acquired an interest in our client got 1,500 new orthodontic case referrals per year. The other 4 orthos in town went from getting 1,500 to getting 0. Their 4 practices became unsellable. So keep an eye on what's going on in your community, because if a large invisible DSO were to acquire your competitors and or your referral sources, it can make a change in your community, and it can happen rapidly. So let's talk about the benefits of having an invisible DSO partner. The number one question that we get from doctors is, what's going to change after I do a deal with these folks? Are they going to put somebody in my office and tell me how to run things? The answer is no. The invisible DSOs don't have the capability, nor do they have the desire to manage your practice. They're investing in your practice by buying anywhere from 51 to 90% of the practice for cash in your pocket. But what they're counting on is that you as an owner will continue to run that practice profitably and efficiently because you're an owner. A percentage of the profits from your practice are going to benefit you, so they're counting on you to continue managing your practice. In endo, one of the number one benefits that the prospective partners talk about is that they are developing payer reimbursement leverage. In other words, they're going to get reimbursed at higher rates than independent endodontists will. And that is happening, and that makes them very interested in geographic concentration. So for instance, we did a transaction for a great endo practice in December, and the group that bid the highest out of 6 bidders, there were 2 multi-specialty bidders and 4 endo-only bidders. And the endo-only bidders ended up winning this because adding this practice to their footprint in Georgia would give them more payer leverage to get higher reimbursement rates from the insurers in Georgia. So there are a lot of reasons that doctors can achieve higher values that they may not be aware of. We were aware of that. We knew what the buyer's strategy was, so we were able to leverage the multiple bidders and the knowledge that one of the bidders was trying to solve a payer reimbursement challenge, we were able to get the doctor a phenomenal deal, and he makes a great reference for us, as you can imagine. So let's talk about what are the ideal practice traits. Typically, we focus on groups that have $500,000 in EBITDA and up. That's because we can get the highest number of bidders and achieve the highest value for them. That doesn't mean we don't work with practices smaller than that. In endo, we do on a relatively often because there are so many eager bidders for endos of all sizes. So y'all are in a very unique place. These are some of the attributes that they look for. One of the challenges sometimes is when you have a large, we've worked with a 14 owner endo group, and it's tough to get them to make a decision. And some of the buyers become a little frustrated when they're dealing with very large endo practice groups where you have equal owners and nobody can come to a consensus. It becomes painful. Identifiable gains and synergies is something to talk about. Again, they're going to be very interested in you if you know other endo groups in your area that may be interested in joining their team, either along with you or after you join. One of the things that's relatively unique about the new endo groups is they are contacting doctors directly. I would bet every person on this phone call has been contacted by at least one endo-only group. And the reality is that you've probably had multiple contacts. Certainly this is fine, but the reality is you're in the business of fixing teeth and we're in the business of doing deals. And frankly, you're a lot better at fixing teeth than we are. And we're a lot better at doing deals than you are. It pays to have a specialist help you, whether it's us or somebody else. I urge you not to do a deal by yourself. So let's talk about the two different types of buyers. The multi-specialty groups may own dozens or hundreds of practices across the country. They are now more excited about endo than they were, call it a year ago. Thank you, COVID. And the endo-only groups are very aggressive at the moment, and their goal is to grow. Your compensation dictates your initial value. Again, compensation is typically 40%, and we've seen it range from 35 to 45. One of the other common questions we get is, I have an associate who I have promised ownership to in the future. The answer is all of these groups want your current and future associates to have an ownership interest either in your practice or in the group. And so they will facilitate that happening. They know that you can't keep nor recruit great associates without giving them a path to ownership. So that is something that each of them approach a little bit differently, and that's a question that you will ask each of them during the dating process. But it is something they all, without exception, believe in. When you try and do these transactions by yourself, the number one thing you're missing out on is no bidding war. When these groups get into a bidding war, we can get significantly higher values. That Atlanta practice I referenced earlier, his initial offer versus the one he got later from the same group, there was a $3 million spread in value. These groups hate to lose to each other. More importantly is the process when you have multiple bidders is you get to meet every one of these groups and decide which one's the right fit for you. What we always like to tell doctors is these transactions are not a one-night stand, they're a marriage. Any of these transactions are going to require the doctor to be there for years. And so you want to pick a partner that has the same values, goals, and vision that you have. And so it's important to meet multiple ones. As a part of the process, once you choose the one or two groups that you think you may want to become associated with, you're going to have conversations directly with other doctors that have done transactions with the group that you are considering. And these are one-on-one, you and the doctor, and you get to ask questions like, why did you do it? Would you do it again? Are you glad you did it? Did they do what they said they were going to do? What changed? What didn't change? So you go into any one of these transactions with your eyes wide open and fully informed as to what to expect. A lot of people ask us this today because of the impending tax increase. They want to get a deal done in 2021. Typically, a transaction will take about 6 months from the time somebody becomes our client to the time that they get cash in their pocket. So you really want to start on this process sooner rather than later. Some deals take longer, some take shorter. Fortunately, the endo buyers are relatively fast compared to some of the other groups. But this is something you should understand now. You should get with your CPA and understand the impact of the proposed taxes. But now is a great time to be at least considering and understanding the value of your practice in today's market. One of the common questions we get is, what happens to my team? Well, the reality is, if you love your team, they love your team because it's your team. So you're going to be the one who is responsible for hiring and firing and figuring out who gets paid what and what vacation days are and when you're open and when you're not and what payers you accept and what payers you don't accept. They're not going to come in and dictate much of anything. Their goal is to have a collaborative process with you to achieve your mutual goals of growth and higher profitability. And all of that is talked about early on in the process. This is not something that's sprung upon you after closing. You're going to know exactly what to expect when you do it. What is the LPS fee? Our fee is functionally free because of the values that we achieve for our doctors. We have a nice long list of references who say, yep, the gross dollar amount of our fee was high, but because they got us an extra several $1 million, their fee was functionally free. But to answer the question directly, our fee is 9% of the transaction value, plus we get a bonus if we do something special, which we can talk about when you give me a call. Why use LPS versus do it yourself? The simple question is, we're specialists in dental and large transactions, and last year, the majority of our transactions, the great majority of our transactions, were for specialists. One of the things that's interesting is being ready. I met with an orthodontist in Dallas on Monday night, and I said, we need to look at your numbers and you need to get ready because there's a lot of groups interested in Dallas, and there may be a transaction that comes up where you can get an extraordinary value for an extraordinary reason. So coincidentally, I spent the night Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday having dinner with buyers of a phenomenal orthopedo practice in Oklahoma City. And one of those buyers is very interested in the strategy of going north-south on Interstate 35, which runs from Duluth, Minnesota, through Minneapolis, through Omaha, through Kansas City, through Oklahoma City, through Dallas, through Austin, down to San Antonio. So this particular group is interested in any practices that are, call it, within 100 miles of Interstate 35 on a north-south basis. This is kind of an interesting strategy. We see lots of groups that want California or want the West Coast or want the East Coast or want the Midwest, but very rarely have we seen one that has identified a vertical or a north-south interstate and said, I want to follow that interstate. So my Oklahoma City group, one of the 6 bidders on that transaction, was very interested in that strategy. So I called my Monday night Dallas dinner partner and said, hey, get your numbers ready because there may be an extraordinary deal here. When you find groups that have a very specific strategy for certain types of practices, and this is a group that's pursuing a dental trifecta, which means they want to buy pedo, ortho, and oral surgery in the same community so that they can cement referral relationships. Sometimes there becomes unique opportunities that are time driven. So we urge any doctors that are considering this to at least go through our process. Let us take a look at your numbers and determine your value because it may be useful to you. So for instance, there's one endo-only group that's exceptionally interested at the moment in the San Francisco Bay Area. So practices in that area are getting a premium over what they would have gotten 6 months ago and a premium over what they will probably get 6 months from now. So let's talk about what creates value. If you can be the first practice in a region and you have a large practice, you can become a platform for that region. You're going to get a higher value than if you're the second guy in that region with a particular DSO. So we go out of our way to try and position our clients as being the first for somebody new to an area because they get higher values. Age is often something I get some grief about. I'm 61, so I can commiserate with those over 65 shortly. Over 65 is harder. It's not impossible, but having multiple doctors in a practice or a very specific plan to not replace the doctor. Again, they'd like you to stay until you die. But having a plan for doctors over 65 is absolutely critical, especially today. Thank you, COVID. One of the things that you can't control is your location, and I'm not talking about what corner you're on, but where you are geographically, and different things impact values of practices in ways that you probably don't imagine. So for instance, Houston, after its floods, became a less desirable area, even if the practice wasn't damaged. The investors in these groups are now taking, we'll call it, geographical issues very seriously. As an example, a year ago, we could sell any great practice, 15 months ago, we could sell any great practice in Manhattan, New York, to a long list of bidders. Today, there is only one group that is interested in New York. That will change, I'm sure, but timing is critical in this business, and things can change. Fires in California, et cetera. So if you're an ortho, which you're not, adult concentration makes them very nervous. The general view of the investors is that we are not out of a recession anytime soon, and therefore adults will defer extraneous expenditures like straighter teeth. It's good to be a pedo because they believe that children will always receive both necessary and optional care, and that may come at the expense of the parents' dental care. Timing is important in this business. Things change. I'm sure many of you remember 2008, and that was actually really 2008 to 2012. The old model of your associate is going to buy you out. If you have a large practice, this is no longer happening because the associate already has school debt and is unable to borrow the kind of values that your practice is worth to be able to buy you out. And understanding how you structure today your associate buy-in agreements is important. We run into a lot of doctors where they had the associate buys in at 70 or 80% of collections, and yet his practice is now worth, or her practice is now worth 2 or 3 times collections. And so there's a whole lot of built-in profit in some of these associate agreements, which becomes troublesome for the owner doctors. We talked about being the first or the second, and sometimes you can get extraordinary values if your timing is right and if you are ready. Being ready means having clean financial statements. We talked about age a little bit. If you're older, having an associate is going to be critical to long-term value. We have an interesting fee structure in that we get paid absolutely nothing unless a transaction is completed. So we're very interested in completing transactions. And unlike everybody else in this business, we don't get paid by the buyers. Most of the groups in our shoes may quote a lower rate to you, but they're also getting paid by the buyer, which ultimately reduces your purchase price. We try and be very creative in how we structure transactions, not only for tax purposes, but how can we add value to our clients to get them a higher value. Since we're getting paid a percentage of what you get paid, it's always in our best interest to get you more. And it's not just about the money up front, it's about the deal structure. We want to make sure that you have liquidity on any of that retained equity, which is a part of generally every deal we do. And it's important to understand all of the elements of these transactions because there are little things that can hurt you. So for instance, one of my favorites that just about everybody misses is that the lease that is signed, let's assume you own your real estate, the lease that buyer or your new partner signs with you, the real estate owner, is absolutely critical to the ultimate value of your building. I have seen many doctors sign leases in which they have basically rendered their property illiquid without the permission of their new partner. And sometimes that permission can be expensive. So watching little features in the agreement is important. In a typical transaction between an invisible DSO and a doctor today, there are over 300 pages of legal documents, and it's important that you choose an attorney who has done a dentist to DSO transaction, and preferably many of them. And we obviously read every word of every document because that's part of what we get paid for. And there can be, and not necessarily intentionally, but it's important to understand all of the elements of a transaction. We talked about how our process is like marriage, and it's really true. So we'll set up a first date, which is functionally a call between our client and a prospective buyer or multiple prospective buyers. Assuming that first date goes well, we'll schedule a second date, which means me or one of my partners will meet the buyer and you at your practice for an after-hours practice tour. And then we'll all go have dinner and tell stories. And you'll get to know them and they'll get to know you. And we'll typically, in one of these transactions, go on 3 to 5 second dates, meaning a lot of eating involved. And after that, you will receive proposals from each of the groups that you've met with, or maybe not all of them. And then it's time for you to figure out which of these proposals is attractive to you. And then we're going to meet the family by talking to other doctors who have done deals with the group that you're considering. And then hopefully you will lead to engagement, which means you'll sign a letter of intent, which basically outlines the terms of a deal. And once the terms are outlined, the prospective partner is going to start their due diligence on you, which means they're going to do an audit of your financial statements, often called a QOE test, quality of earnings test. And then the lawyers will start haggling over the documents, and we will be involved to make sure that the tax structure and the tax allocation is structured the way it should be. These are important transactions. These are life-changing transactions. The good news is, in a post-closing in one of these transactions, life is pretty much the same. Certainly some of the administrative burden will be reduced. Certainly you'll have the opportunity to purchase supplies at lower costs. You will hopefully benefit from higher reimbursement rates. You will usually benefit from better marketing. And there are a lot of opportunities to grow practices when you have a partner that has resources and capital, which you can access on a risk-free basis. And with that, we'll talk a little bit about what we do. We think every doctor should at least understand the value of your practice. And so we provide what is functionally a market value analysis of your practice by taking a look at your financial statements after signing a non-disclosure agreement. We're going to ask questions about that process or through that process, and then you and I will have a conversation about what I believe is possible for your practice. There's no obligation, it's confidential, and it's free. But now is a great time to fully understand the value of your practice. If tax laws do change, it's going to have a significant impact, both short-term and long-term, on the net value of your practice. And with that, I would love to take any questions, and I appreciate you taking the time to hear our story.
Thank you, Chip. I have some questions. We do have some questions, but before I get to those, I'd like to again invite viewers to use the question box in your control panel to ask any questions that you have. Our first question is, will an IDSO help me build another location?
Yes, absolutely. They will help you pick the location, and they will then handle the lease negotiations with a place that you have agreed to, and they will handle the entire build-out process to your specifications, and at the end, hand you the keys and say, good luck, how do we help you market this?
Okay, thank you. Another question, do I have to use specific vendors or dental suppliers or dental supplies?
No, with most of these groups, you do not. However, what they're going to do is ask you to look at what you currently buy and look at the prices from the same vendors for the same brand of products that they're getting, and they would expect you, if you can buy the same products through their relationships, they're going to expect that you would do that. So if your brother-in-law is your rep, he may have a problem.
Okay, what happens to my team members?
The team members are usually excited about these transactions once they understand them. Number one, they're gaining security. Typically, they're getting better benefits, and they're often getting retirement plans and other benefits that you may not be offering. So the team members, once they understand these transactions, are very excited about it. And oftentimes, there's opportunities for them to expand within the group. As an example, we sold the second largest oral surgery practice to a group in Utah. And the office manager of that group, with the permission of the doctors, was offered an opportunity to become the regional manager that covered the entire state at a significantly higher salary, more responsibilities, and more opportunity.
Great. Okay. What are the risks of partnering with an IDSO?
You know, the risks are interesting. Functionally, the only risk that you have is the value of the equity that you retain. So if you do a transaction where your practice is worth $10 million, you sell 80% of it for cash, you're getting $8 million in cash, and you're going to have a 20% ownership interest remaining in your practice or in the parent company. So really the only risk that you have there is that 20% equity. If for some reason your practice fails or the parent company fails, that equity value could be reduced or eliminated. Fortunately, historically, in the last 3 decades, there have been very few DSOs that have failed, and the great majority have created exceptional value for the doctors through their equity. But technically, that would be the risk.
Okay. And the last question is, how will an IDSO impact my referring partners?
You know, that's a really good question, and that becomes an important part of the partner that you choose. So for instance, if you have a multi-specialty group that's interested in you and happens to own 20 GP practices in your area, typically we would not urge a doctor to do that transaction, because while these are invisible DSOs and this is silent, word travels. And the last thing your current GP referral sources want to do is refer business to you if your new partner owns 20 GP practices that compete with them. So it's very important to fully understand the impact of a partner, and that's something that we spend a lot of time working on. So the answer is you just have to be careful. And the good news is any great endo today is going to have at least 5 bidders, so they're going to be able to choose the group that won't damage their existing referral sources and instead may add referral sources.
Okay, well, thank you, Chip, and thank you everyone for your questions. But we've run out of time today, so if we did not get to your question, we will answer it after the webinar via email. Please be sure to take the free CE quiz associated with this webinar. Shortly, we will send you a recording of this presentation and instructions on how to access the CE quiz. Thank you all again for attending, and a special thank you to Chip Fitchner and our sponsor for this webinar, Large Practice Sales. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you all.